delay. We are trying to meet in person, had some technical difficulties. I'm going to call the July 19th, 2021 meeting of the Woodbridge Board of Education to order at 7:12 p.m. with a reminder to all those watching and participating to kindly mute your microphone at this time to avoid background noise. First thing on the agenda. Is there any correspondence? No correspondence this evening. Public comment? Is there any public comment? Please raise your hand in the chat participants section. I do not see any public comment this evening. So we'll move on to the superintendent's report. Dr. Budd.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the board, I wish to give special recognition this evening to Joyce Shavers, who has recently tendered her resignation as a member of the Board of Education. Joyce has been an active member of the board, including as chair of the Finance Committee and as vice chair of the full board. At the August meeting of the board, Joyce will be officially recognized for her dedicated service. I wish to provide a brief update on the beehive of activity that is Beecher Road School this July. Between our summer enrichment program, our extended school year program, and our summer learning academy, over 250 students are participating in programming meeting their special social, emotional, and academic needs. In addition, we are pleased to be the host site for the town of Woodbridge Recreation Department's programming. While summer is certainly quieter in some ways than the rest of the year, Beecher truly is the school that never sleeps. At this time, I'd like to recognize our new liaison from the town of Woodbridge Board of Selectmen, Sheila Mcrevan, who is a former member of this Board of Education. I know we're all pleased to have Sheila as our liaison, and I'd like to give her the opportunity to say a few words this evening.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much. I just wanted to say hello to everyone there, many familiar faces and some new as well, and introduce myself and let you know that I'm going to try to attend all of your meetings if I can, at least the main regular meetings of the Woodbridge Board of Education. And I'd like to be able to provide to you a very brief update on things that are happening at the Board of Selectmen level. I think it's really important that we keep communications flowing both ways. So I'd also be happy to answer questions that you might have along the way during the year, especially as we develop budgets. We know that as a result of the annual town meeting that was recently held, lots of people have questions about budget. So we want to be able to communicate to them all along. So the one thing I will tell you about the most recent Board of Selectmen meeting is that we've set a special Board of Selectmen date to meet and discuss the bonded projects, one of which is the roofs over your head there. I believe it's D-Wing and K-Wing. So that will take place on Wednesday, July 28th. The Board of Selectmen is meeting exclusively by remote at this point for at least that meeting and the next foreseeable few meetings. So if you'd like to attend that, you'll be able to attend remotely and watch as we go through that. If there are questions, etc. The plan right now is to be able to send this to referendum. So I'll keep you updated on that. I'm sure First Selectman Beth Heller will be keeping Dr. Budd updated and Lynn and everyone else there as well. But that's it from me.
Thanks, Sheila. I'm also pleased to introduce to the community this evening Mr. Richard Hewitt, who has begun as the district's interim director of business services and operations following the recent retirement of Al Pulo. Richard retired as finance director from the Darien Public Schools and since then has served in interim roles in Hebron, Wilton, East Haven, Region 15, and Region 4. His reputation is outstanding and his experience deep, and so I'd like to give him the opportunity to say a few introductory remarks to you this evening.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in Woodbridge. Just to give you a brief background of my skills, I have been a school business official for over 40 years. I will tell you that Al Pulo left a well-organized office, probably one of the most organized that I've ever had experience to follow up. I have both education and business background in terms of degrees. And so far in the office, I've found everything well organized and easy to find. So hopefully as time goes on, we will get to know each other a lot better.
Thank you, Richard. A few comments for the community this evening on our implementation of the Woodbridge School District Safe Return to In-Person Instruction and Continuity of Services Plan. Ms. Sherman, Mr. Sapia, Ms. Kiesel, and I are in the process of conducting individual family conferences with all parents and guardians whose children are returning from fully remote learning last year to in-person learning this year. To date, we have met with approximately 60% of these families with a goal of individual conference with each such family by the end of July. We're using responses both to identify general trends we can address and also to learn more about each individual student's current profile to help us best transition that particular student back to Beecher. I speak for all of us when I say that these conversations are proving to be wonderful ways for us to engage with our families. And beyond that, I continue to encourage anyone with questions to reach out to us. The most prevalent topic in terms of safe return, frequently asked questions, is extended day for the fall. We are still awaiting Connecticut State Department of Education guidance on fall parameters for after-school programming. Because our extended day program is an extension of the school district, we're obligated to follow such parameters. At the same time, we must ensure that reopening extended day within the CSDE parameters can be done fiscally responsibly. I anticipate an update to the Beecher Road community later this week. Finally, in preparation for Nick Caruso's work with us tonight and considering the essential work of the Connecticut Association of Boards of Education in helping all of us function most highly as a team, I end by referencing an African proverb cited at the recent RIDES conference Ms. Sherman and I attended. The proverb is, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Tonight's workshop by Mr. Caruso is a key way for us all, both to go far and to go together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Budd. Next on the agenda is, well, before I move on, are there any questions from board members about the superintendent's report? I don't see anyone. We'll move on to new business. In light of the change in the board membership, I'm going to ask for two separate motions on the approval of the minutes. And just so that the board is aware, the governor has issued an order for roll call on every vote that's taken now, since we'll be meeting in a hybrid model. So I'm first ask for a motion on the approval of Okay. I'll ask for a motion on the July 12th, 2021 minutes. Jeff Hughes is moving approval of the July 12th, 2021 minutes. Do I have a second? Brooke Hopkins. Dr. Budd, do you have some discussion on the July 12th, 2021 minutes that you would like to present to the board?
Sure. Thank you, Lynn. I've been asked by legal counsel to clarify one aspect of the special meeting of the board last Monday, July 12th. As you all know, the purpose of the meeting was to elect the board's officers, which is a vitally important aspect of the board's functioning. It requires naturally full faith of each member of the board and the public in the process. In accordance with state statute, the board's election of officers occurred by written ballot. After each vote, the clerk tallied the ballots and announced the vote totals. The day after the meeting, I received a request to inspect the ballots against the announced vote totals. On Wednesday, July 12th, I did that in the presence of Ms. Kiesel, our Director of Special Services. The ballots, copies of which at our legal counsel's suggestion and attached to the minutes you have before you, indicate that the vote tally for chair was in fact 7-2, not 8-1, as had been announced at the meeting. Therefore, the minutes before you indicate the correct tally of 7-2. The announced vote totals for vice chair and secretary were confirmed to be correct and are also in the minutes before you this evening. I am confident that the error was an inadvertent one. We will institute processes next time the election of officers occurs so that there is a double check process at the same time the voting occurs, with the aim of preventing any inaccuracy, even an inadvertent one, in the announced vote totals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Budd. Any discussion, questions by board members before the vote? All right, so just for the public information, Dr. Michael Strambler is not with us this evening, and Dr. David Ross is joining us remotely. So I'll call the roll for the motion to approve the minutes of July 12th.
Lynn, can I ask a question?
Ms. Madonic? Yes, approve. Ms. Delpreet? Oh, sorry. Dr. Ross, do you have a question? You're on mute, David.
Yeah, sorry, unmuting. I don't see in the minutes, does it actually include within the minutes that it was announced as 8-1 and then corrected after the fact to 7-2?
Could you ask the question again? Because it's hard to hear.
Yeah, sorry. I don't see in the minutes, but maybe I'm missing it. Does it actually indicate in the minutes what was announced in the meeting? I can't hear you, Jonathan.
It does not indicate that the announced vote total was inaccurate in the minutes, although it could if the board wanted to add that in.
Well, I think the minutes should reflect what actually happened. So maybe we could just tag on an amendment that indicates that it was announced as 8-1 at the time and then after the fact was corrected.
Okay. So do we have an amendment to the motion to approve the minutes as suggested and with the suggested amendments?
I move that.
Jeff Hughes, do you amend that motion?
Yeah.
Okay, and Brooke, will you amend the second? Okay. So now the motion is that the meeting minutes will be amended with David's suggestion. So I'll call the roll once again. Ms. Madonic? Yes. Ms. Delpreet? Ms. Hopkins? Yes, thank you. It's hard to hear. Dr. Ross?
Yes.
Yes. Mr. Dahlia?
Yes.
Mr. Hughes? And I vote yes, it's unanimous. We'll move on to the approval of the June 21st, 2021 minutes. I'll just let everyone know that if you're a new board member, you should abstain because you weren't at that meeting. If you are a former board member and continuing on, you can vote on those minutes.
I have a question, actually.
Okay, we're going to have the motion and then we'll have questions. Do I have a motion to accept those minutes? Mr. Hughes, do I have a second? David, can you second that? Thank you
I
very
am
much.
the only other one that can. Yes, I'll second.
Dave, yes, thank you. Okay, discussion.
I have a question about if you were present for that meeting, signed in but not a board member. There was a question by with FOI if that was still acceptable to vote.
Do you know that answer, Dr. Budd?
Do believe it's the case then. Do believe it's the case for Robert's rules that only the people who were elected on the board at the time and were serving can vote, because other people might have participated in the public, but weren't actually board members.
I would guess that's correct as well. So I will call the roll, and as I stated before, new members who were not members of the board at the time can abstain. Maria,
Abstain.
Sarah Beth, Brooke, David,
Yes, could you please, for the people who aren't at a microphone, could you just repeat it? Because I can't actually hear anyone other than you and Jeff and Jeff's camera.
okay.
Thanks.
So Maria abstained, Sarah Beth abstained, Brooke abstained,
Cool.
and you
Thank you.
voted yes.
Yes.
Jay is abstaining. Jeff Hughes is voting yes, and I'm voting yes. The vote is 4 yes, 0 no, 4 abstentions. Thank you. Oh, Mike isn't here. I'm sorry. Let me correct that. 3 yes, 0 no, 4 abstentions. I counted Mike. I'm sorry. It's not here. My apologies. Next on the agenda is adopt policy 5113, attendance, excuses, dismissal. Is there a motion to adopt policy 5113? Jeff Hughes had made a motion. Do I have a second? Brooke Hopkins has seconded. Dr. Budd, do you have anything you want to say about 5113?
Yes, all of our previous policy committee members have retired from the board, so I'm representing our exciting group in bringing this forward. The prior board approved it for 30-day review without changes, and you see a cover sheet. Essentially, this has been discussed both at the policy committee and at the curriculum committee because there's some relationship to teaching and learning. But we have clarified, and the red changes are what are different from the current policy. We've clarified the procedures for parents wishing to call their students in absent from school, and streamlined the best practices there. And then in addition, on page 4, the State Department allows us to provide what are called excused absences for students participating in what are called extraordinary educational opportunities. But we, in order to do that, need to have language that's basically the same as you see there in the policy about what would count as an extraordinary educational opportunity, and also what a parent would do if the parent wanted to pursue that route. So in looking at other policies of districts to which we compare, adding this language makes sense because for certain students, learning in certain venues, etc., outside of Beecher Road School might be appropriate. So this is the same as the prior board saw at its June meeting, and they did not have suggestions on it, which is why it comes to you tonight for adoption. And the timeliness of this is then we would be able to publicize the revisions in our student parent handbook for implementation in August, September.
Thank you, Dr. Budd. Board members, any questions, comments? I'll call the roll. Maria?
Yes.
Sarah Beth? Brooke? David? David voted yes. Everyone else has voted yes so far. Sorry, David. Jay? Jay votes yes. Jeff Hughes? Jeff Hughes votes yes. And I vote yes. It's unanimous. Next on the agenda is Cabe Workshop. Dr. Budd, would you like to do the introductions this evening?
Dick Caruso is so well respected in the state. I think he interacts with every board of education every year, or so it seems. And nearly every superintendent I speak to speaks about the powerful role that Nick has played in their districts. And so while Nick could probably stay with us 20 hours this evening to discuss every possible topic under the sun, tonight's goal is a kind of introductory roles and responsibilities for board members. But I want to just observe that I think I represent Nick in saying this is better, the more interactive it is. And so I will be turning my camera in a moment to focus on Nick so Dr. Ross can see him clearly. But I'm pleased to have Nick Caruso from Cabe with us. I know all of us are. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, so I'm going to, based on that, I'm going to ask that the people in this room now mute so that we can hear just Nick speak. Thank you.
Here's some of the things we'd like to cover. And there's about 6 or 8 hours worth easily do in one evening. So, way I think I would like to start tonight is by asking each of you, and I bet much everybody already would. When you are brand new to the board, or how long you serve, and then what do you hope we covered? And we'll try to figure out the ones that are most popular. Not to do too much advertising for us, we're doing this for enough.
Years, both responsibilities. I think 2 years there, we might have stepped out of the lane a few times, so I think roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, I think I've been on the board. Or how to respond in what settings, both face to face with other families, little league field, and also on social media. What are other ways that are speaking and interacting?
Small topic. Sure. You want to add anything?
I'm okay with this, yeah.
But they're almost dictated by. Like to know what so interested in diversity and what Cabe's policies ideas are.
I can speak to that a little bit. I'm probably not the best person to do that. Not really policy or government. Not daily basis. I think. Okay, so Monday. David.
So David, you're online, and you could introduce yourself to Nick, please.
I actually can't hear a single thing. Nothing that's been said in the past 10 minutes has been intelligible. I've been texting with Jonathan to tell him that, but it's totally unintelligible. Hi, I'm Dave. I'd love to be able to hear what's happening, but I can't hear anything.
I apologize for that. Jonathan's trying to come up with a solution. I wish I thought I could have brought a Bluetooth headset so I could have walked around, but we'll keep trying, Dave.
I can hear you when you're standing that close to the computer. That's the first time I've been able to hear your voice.
So, David, what we were each asked is our name, how long we've served on the board, and what we want to learn tonight.
Swell. I'm Dave. I've been on the board for 2 years. I don't know if I have a specific agenda. I'm curious to hear more of your suggestions for the team.
Okay, great. And I'll try to stay here so that you can keep hearing.
If there were other ideas shared, I would love to know what they were, because I mean, again, I think the governor's order is that it needs to be accessible. There are other people who are participating remotely as well. So whatever's happened in the past 10 minutes is a black hole for any of us online.
Sure. So basically, there was a request to talk a little bit about Cabe. I'm going to hold that till the end because I don't want to dominate that conversation. Most people want to just learn about roles and responsibilities, where the lines of demarcation are between that superintendent and such, how to interact with the public, and I would include staff with that because there's a role to play when you're in a school and you're confronted or approached by staff, and how, the appropriate way to deal with that. Also social media and DEI. So that will take up some of our time. I know some of the other things that came up in conversation with your board leadership last week included, and I put the list down and left it behind, but committee work, was dependence on committees or how they function. Also potentially caucusing. I know that was a question that came up. And frankly, if we get to those and all this stuff will have had a pretty good night. And again, I can come back and we can focus on specific areas as well. Because I do want this to be interactive. I don't want to present for, I mean, given the time, it will be more presentation than conversation, but I benefit better when it's a conversation too. So I'm going to do my best to do that. So, David, I have no idea whether you could see.
No, it's totally unreadable.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read it so that you hear it too. But it's a simple question. How many school board members does it take to screw in a light bulb? I'm going to ask everybody what that is. All of them? That's the second best answer. Okay, well, I won't keep you in suspense. None. It's up to the board to say, let there be light. The board establishes policy. The board establishes vision, goals, however you do it here, strategic planning, whatever vehicle you use to determine what the expectations are for the district is, that's the let there be light. It's the superintendent's job to decide, are we going to use incandescent lighting, LED, candles, solar, etc. That's the superintendent's job working with staff, and it's also the superintendent's role to assign that task to the appropriate person. And the reason I put this in is because there have been times when I've worked with boards and we've talked about this, that come to find out the superintendent in one district, very small district, while we were sort of going through this presentation, I noticed the superintendent furiously writing on a legal pad through the whole meeting. And finally, I got curious and I said, so what's going on? What are you doing? She goes, I'm taking the minutes. You're taking the minutes. One of the board members literally stood up and said, she's screwing in a light bulb. And she was absolutely right. I felt that night that I had actually accomplished something. And so we stopped and we talked about it. So what would the role be for the board regarding giving the appropriate support to the superintendent? Because, you know, have any of you ever had to take minutes in a meeting? Well, I know when I'm in a meeting and someone says, who's going to take the minutes? I go like this. Because I hate taking minutes, because when you do that, you're not engaged. You're so focused on listening that you can't participate. And I want the chief executive officer of my board fully participating in the meeting. So that's an area where I think it's important. And in this case, what the board did is say, so what would it take for you to become back as our CEO? And she said, we need, I don't know, whether it was $50 a meeting back then or something, to pay someone to come in and do the take the minutes, and they said money well spent. But they hadn't thought about that before. All they thought about is, well, we're saving $50 a meeting. And they hadn't thought through the ramifications of that. So that is part of your job, I think, is to provide the necessary tools for success. And that includes letting your CEO be the CEO of the district. And, you know, like he's trying to get some audio stuff going here now. And that's cool. Well, if we move this too, okay, no one else will hear me, but we'll do our best. Sure. Can you see the screen okay, or? I can't tell.
David, can you see that?
Oh my.
Almost. If I switch my view and make him full screen, I can almost do it. Is there no way to screen share? It's clearly coming off of a computer.
Is there a way to screen share?
Let's see.
He would have to be logged into the meeting on the computer that he's sharing on.
Screen one.
It's not, Dave.
Share. I'm not getting. Start Google Chrome now. I'm not seeing PowerPoint here, so it's shareable. Okay. Well, I can't share my screen. All right, I'm gonna still be back to death by PowerPoint or reading everything. So again, we've talked about the role of the board, say, let there be light. Superintendent's job is to decide what kind of light we're going to use. And then it's part of the responsibility of the board to evaluate the quality of lighting. So during your board meetings, you should be having regular reports from this administration on the data that's coming into the district. So if you had a new reading program that you voted on maybe a year or two ago, it's important to know that that reading program is being effective. And so do we do it every 6 months, once a year? Depending on what it is, what the initiative is, part of your job as board members is to understand what part of your superintendent's job is to help explain. In fact, one of my favorite questions when something new is presented to you as a request, well, two questions actually. One, what's it going to look like if it's done well? And two, how are we going to know if it's being done well? And I think that's part of the administration's responsibility, is to come up with the level of metrics or the rubric or whatever you want, all these education terms, to help you understand, because you know your staff's doing that. If they're changing instruction and changing curriculum, they are measuring how successful the kids are. And I think it's important for board members to kind of understand, you know, not necessarily into the granular stuff, but certainly, you know, those areas that have been a focus of the board, where are we? In fact, if you have goals, my suggestion is that right on every agenda includes the topic report on goals. And it doesn't have to be a full elaborate 40-minute presentation. It could just be 30 seconds of item 3 on the agenda tonight is directly related to goal number 2. At next month's meeting, we're going to present to you a report on the foreign language program, assuming you have one in an elementary school, but a lot of schools do. And if you do, good for you. But so that could be part of the report. But what it does is reminds you that your goals are important. And it reminds your staff and your administration that this is something we're looking at. Because I've worked with districts, I think I've probably helped boards set goals 150, 200 times. And almost never, and if I go back a year later, almost never are they prepared to talk about last year's goals. They only want to talk about what we want to do next. And so part of my challenge is when you set goals, let's take that extra step of how are we going to know this next year, throughout this year, that one, we can make sure this is successful, and that two, how we're going to know. So again, it's just some things to think about. I don't want to keep this sort of the 50,000 foot level for now, but to give you some ideas on some things that could help you as board members. And this is really going to drive the people on screen crazy. Basically, I've put 841 little smiley faces on this PowerPoint slide. And there's 841 of those faces representing the 841 children that are in the Woodbridge Public School. It's last year's student SSP's strategic school profile might be lower this year because a lot of kids probably went remote, but 841 children whose entire future, I want you to think about this for a minute, their entire future rests on what happens in this building. Because if they get a good start in this building, they are much more likely to have a successful life than if they fail in elementary school. And I want you to think about that, think about the importance of that. And I hope you embrace that idea that this is really important work that you are doing. And make no mistake about it, the decisions you make as a board influence that and can make that better or worse. And we'll talk about some of the things that can help you do that, working together as a board, because I think it's just too important. I served short term on my town council, and I got off because I did not feel that work was anywhere near as important as the 10 years I served on the school board, because what you do matters. And I really, if you take away nothing else tonight, I want you to take away the importance of what I said, because I really believe it. We'll get off the soapbox now, I promise. I'll probably get back on again. Another thing to think about as you go about your work, this is the Eisenhower Matrix. People have seen variations of this for years. Things are either urgent or not urgent. and they're important or unimportant. And depending on what you're dealing with as a board, what your superintendent's dealing with as an administrator, things are going to fall into these categories. Now, if it's urgent and unimportant, well, obviously it has to get done. Most of the time, that falls into the domain of the superintendent because it's urgent, it's immediate, and it's important. So it becomes part of his job. Now, if you've done your job as a board, there's policy guidance to make it easy for the superintendent to know what to do. And that's why, again, policy is part of that, let there be light aspect of the job. How do we guide our administration? How do we guide our school district forward through the legal means that we have? Because you are required by law to do policy. Policy is the manual of the district. Basically, it is the law of the district. And so your policies have weight. And if you can use more of those policies to guide what's important, it makes everybody's life easier. If it's not urgent, but it's important, that typically would fall into the domain of the board. That's where you'd set goals, you'd set vision for what the expectation would be, knowing that this is a long-term process. It's not something we anticipate doing immediately, but it's something that we want to share our vision going forward and get to it, the place that we want to go. Going down to the other two quadrants, if it's urgent but not important, a horrible place to be a superintendent, because urgent means somebody has a deadline. And part of the superintendent's job is to balance what's important, what's not. And frankly, since COVID started, it's all urgent and it's all important. That unfortunately, the superintendent's role has changed dramatically. And I think in some cases, the board's role has changed dramatically. In fact, I'm going to go to the next slide because this is what COVID has done. And I did it messy on purpose because it's messy. If it's urgent and important, it has to be done. And again, we watched over this past year as sometimes weekly, the regulations changed, the laws changed, the executive orders changed. And your superintendent was charged mostly either through your trust and support through policy or through direct directive from government, the state government, that certain things had to be done. It's not by choice. It has to be done. So your role as a board becomes, kind of more, what do you need from us, rather than this is what we want you to do. How do we all get successful? Because frankly, a lot of that long-term stuff, the planning has been by the wayside for the last year. I worked with a couple districts this year that said, we want to set goals. What's that going to look like for the next year or two? In one case, they decided maybe it's setting priorities instead of goals, that we just want to, as we go through this, what are the things we want to remember? Health and safety, or doing the best we can to keep kids from getting behind, or, so they prioritize their concerns. In other case, their goals focused more on the next couple of years, which is basically how do we plan for remediating all the children that slip through the cracks. And frankly, I think most boards need to probably spend the most time over this next year or two. And it's probably those year or two decisions are going to impact kids for several years, because these kids are behind in, when you have kindergarten and K8, K6, that's right, the middle school. So that's 6-7 years of a generation that or 7 generations, that you would have to be anticipating the needs of. So, and hopefully the high school is also anticipating that, planning ahead to what are we going to have to do when we get these kids to make sure that they got what they needed, or that we can provide what they need. So I'm assuming there's going to be a lot of interaction between the central offices, looking at curriculum, looking at assessment, to make sure that we don't let kids slip through the cracks. And I would only go one step further. If it's not important and if it's not urgent, don't even worry about it. And you'll need some guidance from your superintendent to help you, because sometimes it might be urgent in the mind of a parent. Why aren't we doing this? And to that parent, it's very important. But you're doing the work of all 841. Sometimes we have to, I don't want to, because as a school this size, that I know what the philosophy you have here, you don't want kids to get lost. And it's almost a manageable size to do that, but it sometimes means prioritizing things, and your superintendent's gonna have to help guide you through that. So don't automatically assume every time someone comes up with a question that you're gonna drop everything and solve it for that person, because you may or may not be able to. But we have limited resources, we have to figure out how to best use them. And that's gonna require a team effort, asking questions, but listening to the answers. So I'm gonna hit you know what I have to do? I have to switch this. Hoping I can do this. So oh, you know what? I know why it's not working. That's the computer itself. So, the question came up about some of the laws and obligations boards have. I want to hit up those that I think are most important to learn right away. And the reason I can say this with some degree of knowledge is because when I was a board member for 10 years, I didn't know a lot of these. I kind of understood laws, but I didn't know the exact wording, and I really wished I did looking backwards, because I think a couple of these in particular are very important for you to understand. So, and again, because this is law, I'm going to read the PowerPoint, probably in best interest of everybody else anyway. But I'm going to start with the Constitution for the state of Connecticut, where they talk about free public schools. And it says, there shall always be free public elementary and secondary schools in the state. The General Assembly shall implement this principle by appropriate legislation. Now, when any of you hear this, does anything stick out like, oh yeah, I didn't think of that? It's hard to remember, all over the train station. So I'll get to it. Basically, the state constitution says there shall be free public schools. So it's a function of the state to provide free public education or free public schools. There's a distinction in the state of Connecticut. And they allocate that responsibility to the Connecticut General Assembly. So it's a state function, and that was done deliberately. The federal forefathers did discuss education as an important aspect of life in America, but they believe that should be a function of the state. And so they left it to states. Connecticut actually put this language in, I believe it was 1962. It was late getting in. They had still assumed the responsibility, but that's when the Constitution caught up with reality in Connecticut. So the legislature didn't want to run schools, unlike where they are now, because I think they try to run a lot of what you are trying to do. But back then they said, okay, we're going to have a law, and it's going to say that each local or regional board of education shall maintain good public elementary and secondary schools, implement the educational interests of the state as defined in section 10.4a, blah, 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 and provide such other educational activities as in its judgment will best serve the interests of the school district. Now, this is the one, in particular, the one I wished I'd understood when I was a board, especially when I was a board chair, being told by our town council what we couldn't do, because there's an awful lot of authority in this language. And this statute actually goes on for several pages, but this is the first paragraph, and in my mind, the most important. Number one, your job, I don't care why you were elected for the board, I don't care what your particular interest in, the number one responsibility of the Board of Education is maintain good public elementary and secondary schools. That's the job. Now, you may fight all day about what good means, and there's a lot of language to talk about good because they don't trust you on that either. But the fact is, that's why school districts exist, to teach children. And your job is to make sure that children in your schools learn. But that's number one. Number two, implement the educational interests of the state. And they are many and they are varied. The state legislature imposes laws on you every year. Our GR department is still going through just the implementer bill alone for all the ramifications on school districts that they slipped through the cracks, let alone all of the bills that passed on their own merit after hearings and such. So it's your responsibility to understand, or your superintendent's job. I read the book soon after I left the board, and I knew my policy manual as a board member, but it's something that wouldn't hurt you to look at the book, but it's certainly most important your superintendent understand what the laws are, because he is charged by you with making sure that this is legit, that we don't violate any laws. It also means that there's a state board of education that has authority over you, and there's a commissioner of education that has authority over you. And in either of those three cases, if they believe that you are not fulfilling their expectations of you as an agent of the state, they can either remove your authority, and they've done that a couple times, or impose other people to come in to monitor you. There's a couple of cases where they appointed a special master, and then one where they appointed a receiver, which was similar. I think they just changed the title, but actually gave more authority. And the first thing that receiver did was put the superintendent on leave of absence and said, we don't need you. And basically the Board of Ed did not meet for 2 years while he was receiver, except during training. Now they went through our lighthouse training. I'll explain that in a second. So we were there every month for 2 years. So they got really good training. That's the only time they got together. And most of the time the receiver did not come to the training too, which I thought was not a good thing, because when they changed receivers, the second one came in regularly, started meeting with the board, started getting up to speed, because everyone knew that at the end of 2 years, the likelihood was the board was going to be given back the authority, and shouldn't they start being taught how to do it well before they had the authority back. And that ended up working out really, really well. So these are groups of people that can take away your authority, or in some cases, depending on some of, like for example, in this last legislation, if you had the name of a sports team that was named after a Native American culture, they were going to withhold the money from the tribes in the casinos for those districts that didn't change it. And so that's an example where the legislature says you're not moving fast enough, or you're not doing this in what we consider the best interest of the schools. So we're going to punish you if you don't. And finally, very important language, provide such other educational activities as in its judgment will best serve the interest of the school district. The other municipal agencies, for example, can tell you what they'd like, but they don't generally have the authority to make you do something. You do what you believe is in the best interest of the school district, and the decisions you make are yours to make. And sometimes that's tough if your relationship with the selectmen or council or whatever form of government you have here is not a healthy one, then you don't want to push buttons or start to cause trouble. However, that being said, if you feel really strongly about something, in our case, it was foreign language in our elementary program. We wanted to add, or middle school, we wanted to add foreign language to 5th and 6th grade, which at that point was our middle school. Members of our town council were outraged that we put money in the budget to do that, and it was more of an adoption type of thing. It wasn't to really start teaching kids, but to get them ready to learn language when they went on to the junior high. But members of our town council were like furious, and they literally cut this, I think it was $63,000 out of our budget and said, we will not support the foreign language program. So we're cutting that money out of the budget. And the board then turned around and said, well, you can take the $63,000, that's within your rights, but you cannot tell us where we're going to spend it. And this is a priority of the board, and we are going to do it. We will take the money from someplace else, but this is something that we believe needs to happen. So I think that's an important thing for all of you to keep in mind as you go through your business. I'll stop for a second. Are there any questions or comments? I don't want to just keep talking at you. I know it's harder in this environment to do anything but. And I'll remember to repeat the question so everyone else can hear it too. Okay. So I mentioned the educational interests of the state. I'm going to go through these rather quickly, but there were 4 listed, and of course the cop-out languages shall include but not be limited to. So they can always expect other things from you, but right now, not be limited to the concern of the state that each child shall have the period prescribed in the general statutes, equal opportunity to receive blah, blah, blah. The 2 words there are equal opportunity. The 2 important words in that part of the statute are that you have to provide equal opportunity. Now, you don't have 2 elementary schools, so you don't have to worry about balancing like some districts do. Is one school getting more than the other? If the neighborhoods are very disparate, maybe it means redistricting to make sure that children are aligned with others so that we can have a more balanced education. It could mean a whole lot of things, including the special ed would fall under this category, that every kid gets the support they need to be successful. But it's very important words that you're going to see mirrored in state and federal law all over the place. You are bound by this principle in everything you do. And in fact, the question came up about DEI. To some extent, that's the same issue facing that. Is there equity? Are we providing the same tools and resources? And does that sometimes mean that depending on a child's background or history, does that or does it not influence the way they learn? And do we have to make allowances for that? Very complex issue, very simple answer. So I know I didn't answer that completely, but I just wanted to make the point as an example of what that means. Well, this one kind of blew up. The idea of meeting a minimum expenditure requirement has really been a challenge the last few years because, basically the state keeps freezing the number, even though you should be getting more and more and more because your costs keep going higher and higher. But that doesn't happen. But the expectation is that your community should be meeting a specific minimum. And this is probably the best time to talk a minute about school finance in general, because you are blamed, and you as a Board of Ed are blamed when you can't meet your budget or when the budget seems too high or whatever. Well, I want to let you in on the ugly truth. And the ugly truth is that it's not about what you spend. It is not a spending problem that faces public schools in Connecticut. I mean, you're faced with the repercussions of this problem, but you're not the cause of it. The reason we have the dilemma we have to some extent is twofold. The first one, back in 1985, and I was a board member back then, the state legislature passed the Education Enhancement Act. And one of the premises behind that was, if I remember correctly, over half the teachers coming into the teaching force were coming in from the bottom thirds of graduating classes. I don't remember the statistic exactly, but that was one of the ones that caught everyone's attention. We were not attracting necessarily the highest quality teachers because we were paying them horribly. And so the legislature said, we're going to pass this law and we're going to let you renegotiate your teacher contracts mid-season. And if you increase the teacher salaries commensurate with what we're trying to accomplish, we will give you that money and we will support education funding in Connecticut 50%. Now that was average. So 50% meant that was the median. You might get less, you might get more, but 50% was the amount of money they were going to put into the pot to disperse it along a variety of ways. What happened, however, was that they didn't do that. They've never put 50% in. My guess, and I haven't seen it recently, but it's probably in the mid 30s, maybe high 30s, but it's typically been around 35, 38%. I wouldn't even be surprised if it was a little lower than that now. And Jonathan's nodding. Correct. Yeah, correct. Less than that. And at the same time, they have reduced the things that were covered by that funding. So along the lines, like transportation, well, we're not going to give you 100%, we're going to give you 50% or 40%. There's a lot of ways they manipulate the money, but what basically they don't do is put enough money in the pot to make it all work. So when you hear them say the funding formula is broken, the funding formula really isn't broken. It's underfunded. Now that's a huge distinction, and unfortunately doesn't help you when you go to your community every spring and say, this is what it's going to take to run this school effectively, because it's not because you're putting too much in that the number is too high. It's because the revenue side is down. The other one of the most significant places you spend money is special education. When those laws were written, and I'm going to say 30, 35 years ago now, I can't remember the exact year, that was built, well, number one, there were far few types of issues supported by the special education laws. There were fewer identifications, so fewer children impacted, and there weren't the ramifications of the legal expenses that there are now. So what happened was their 40% was going to cover a significant part of special education costs. That was the promise, 40%. Anybody hazard a guess to what the percentage actually is? Don't waste your time with 10. That's way too high. 3. On a national, what's that? 5. On a national level, it's about 7.5%. On the Connecticut level, it's about 5. So we are getting far less. And as you all know from looking at your budgets, a lot of the costs aren't the direct services to the children anymore. It's to the lawyers who are representing the families. And it's a legal, appropriate process to make sure people are treated fairly. And everybody gets that. But one little quirk in that law made the biggest difference. And that quirk is that if the family opposes any part of the service that the child is getting, any part, then you pay all their legal expenses. And so what we have are, and I'm really not meaning this in a negative way, but there are law firms that specialize in asking for 100 things, knowing they're going to get one, and you're going to pay for everything. So you're caught between two giant rocks and giant hard places. And it gets really tough because your community looks at you and says, it's your fault, you're over budgeting. And you're not. And I think boards have to stop apologizing when they come in with 6 or 7% budgets. And frankly, that doesn't keep up with the increases, but at least you might be able to maintain mostly everything. But again, it's hard to go in adamantly and say, you've got to give it to us because this is what we need. But if you're not the advocates for your budget, who will be? In fact, I don't even like using that word. We're going to mention that in a couple minutes. But if you're not advocating for the funds to support your school, who is going to? You know, that's got to be an important part of your job. And you are required to provide opportunities for children to interact with other children and staff that are from different social, economic, and racial differences. This came directly out of Sheff versus O'Neill. That was specific to Hartford, but the legislature understood that this wasn't happening just in Hartford. So every school district has to provide some opportunities for kids. And I'm sure you've got some interactive programs with New Haven, probably because you're right next door, send kids to magnet schools or whatever, but there are opportunities. And frankly, it's a law that you must do that. And finally, used the word mandate already a few times, you have to, by law, adhere to mandates. And mandates, they left one word out of this, by the way, it should be unfunded mandates because they don't pay for them. So every time the legislature says, we want you to start doing this, you have to figure out how are we going to pay for it because there's no funding for that in the budget. And if they do it, like if the legislature passed something that is going to start July 1st, your school district already started for the year, you may have to implement something you didn't budget for because it was more immediate. So funding is a challenge. And I think two things helped me knowing the statute. I wish I'd known it when I was, especially when I was board chair in a very contentious budget year, standing before a town meeting and getting my head cut off. But one, it's not your fault that you're asking for what you're asking. And secondly, it's not a spending problem. It's a resource problem. you're, again, as I said earlier, you're faced with the repercussions of that. But I think it's a different approach when you're going to folks to be able to step in and say, I'm not wrong. We may not have the solution that is right for everybody, but it's not because of us not doing our job. I think that's really important. And I'll cover one other thing when we get to it. Just real quickly, I want to cover a couple things because I mentioned the legislature doesn't trust you to know what good means. So there are a multitude of laws. Here's just some. Shall provide an appropriate learning environment for its students, which includes adequate books, supplies, materials, equipment, staffing, facilities, technology, equitably allocate resources among schools, as we said before, and provide a safe school setting. These are all things the legislature expects you to do, and part of what good means. The policy is, I mentioned before, is how you kind of establish your vision. It's also a way the General Assembly dumps some of their mandates onto you in a more palatable way. And I know every year when we work with the legislature, we have a couple lobbyists, so we have a government relations committee that's very active in helping to influence legislation, state and federal. But sometimes throughout the year, you will hear legislators say, we need to do this. You know, whatever this might be. Example, several years ago, a statistic came out that showed that a handful of school districts had proportionately higher percentages of students being expelled than average. So there were a few pockets where the solution to discipline issues was just throw them out of school. And again, not a good solution, but in some places, legislators saw that happening and said, we're going to change the law and make it harder to expel students and require more of them to be taught in school. And with very few exceptions, like, you know, drugs and weapons and things like that, you can't expel kids anymore. Now, I realize you're in elementary school. That hopefully is something you never really have to deal with. But unfortunately it could. But it's an example of the law, because what they did not understand when they passed that law, and I was working with the New Britain board when this was going on, it was going to cost them $1.2 million for all the additional teachers they were going to need to cover in-school suspensions for their, I think it was 3 high schools, because all these kids were no longer going to be expelled, and they had to have people to cover that. So unintended consequences, part of our job is to make sure they learn those before they vote yes or no. But as a strategy, what we will typically do is say, why don't you require a policy rather than mandate what you believe it should be? Let the local district make the decision on what's going to be most effective at the local level. And they are often happy to do that. Not always. Sometimes they'll also study something to death. But in many cases, these are examples in that book of law, laws that they said you should have policies on: discipline, homework, attendance, promotion, detention, drugs, alcohol use, suicide, uniform treatment of recruiters. You don't have to worry about that because you're in elementary school. That's who you allow on campus to, like job fairs or the military or those types of things. Reporting of bus complaints is not call your local school board member and have them fix it for you. You should have a policy that addresses the procedure administratively for dealing if there's a bus complaint. And it shouldn't be call the board chair and ask that something gets done. You must have the superintendent of schools. That's a requirement. I know one district where I think they'd driven out their 3rd or 4th superintendent in a 2-year period, and the chair started publicly saying, we're not going to go through research. He doesn't do any good, and we could do it ourselves. The commissioner of education actually called him up and said, you're going to get a whole lot of trouble if, not allowed. No, and like I said, the commissioner of education literally called him up and said, you can't do that. So, yeah. When in doubt, if it's a serious legal question on anything, there's really 2 avenues. If it's before you've gotten in a lot of trouble, we've got an attorney on staff, and we were actually hoping we'd hire another one. They were just interviewing the other day, who are experts in education law. And if you have a question, it doesn't even have to be, oh no, we're in trouble, but I'm thinking that we should maybe do this. get an answer to that question before you do it. We'd much rather say, please don't do that, than to get the call the next day. Well, last night, if we did such and such, would we be in trouble? Maybe. So that's a free phone call to you. So take advantage of it. And if it's something more specific or it's more actionable, we know there's a pending lawsuit or it's a direct employee matter, then you need to ask the superintendent. In fact, the superintendent will probably be doing that, has a district attorney on speed dial. And frankly, while you have authority over the school district, you don't necessarily have the ability to always know all of those things. The corporate entity known as the board has the ability to make decisions. Individually, you have no authority. You can't walk into the superintendent's office and say, Jonathan, tomorrow I want you to do such and such. He may be polite, and a lot of superintendents try to do the right thing. And well, if it's a little thing, I'll just do it to keep them happy. But the reality is you don't have the authority. And when it comes to knowledge about things, and this also gets to the question before about when I get a call from a parent or a teacher or something, you're not allowed to get involved in employee matters. You're not allowed to get involved in discipline matters unless you are on the hearing panel. And you don't do that before the hearing, because the expectation is that if you make a decision, it's based only on the evidence presented in that hearing. If you know the whole story before you walk in that room, you should recuse yourself. I'm sorry, I know the family. I've heard all about what happened. I can't be impartial walking into this meeting. I have to recuse myself. That's appropriate. Superintendent, by the way, I've used the term earlier, chief executive officer has executive authority over the district. He is responsible for the staff and making operational decisions, not the Board of Ed. And sometimes he may come to you for guidance, or he may come to you and say, I want to do this, but I'm going to need support in the way of resources or whatever. It's your job to make sure it seems appropriate, but then go for it. But in general, administrative decisions are made by administration and may be reported to the board later, or may not, depending on what the issue is. You shouldn't feel the need to know every little thing. Literally, and I won't say where it was, but it was a district very not far from here, where the superintendent told me, I got a call last week from the board chair and wanted to know why we replaced a ceiling panel in the cafeteria. The roof had leaked, and he wanted to know why they replaced the ceiling. That is the essence of minutia. So not a good way of spending your time. The only thing I'll mention here is you must evaluate the superintendent every year. I encourage you not to think of evaluation as a punishment, that it's not a playing gotcha, you only get so many points and you lose, but rather our mission is to help children learn. Are we all doing our best to do that, including how we evaluate the superintendent? Is the work Jonathan's doing moving us forward and improving student achievement? Because that's our job. And if it is, then we should be happy with that. Now, I realize there's other aspects to the job, like communication and being out in the community and getting the confidence of such and such. But it's a way of saying collectively every year, how are we going to get better? How are we going to do better? The other thing I would point out is that the process must be mutually determined and agreed upon. I've seen boards unilaterally say, we're going to change the superintendent evaluation process this year. You can't. It's a mutual process to determine what is it we expect. And usually superintendent, in fact, Cabe and CAPS together worked out a sample of best practice that most districts use. There's plenty of room within it to modify it to make it work for you, but that's an example of a way of doing it properly to make sure that we're meeting our goal, which is to improve learning. I don't want to do that one. This is my other favorite statute, and probably the one that if you forget all the rest of them, please don't forget this one, because this one, while it's called Appropriations and Budget, I want to point out the only place you see the word budget is in the title. So, each local Board of Education shall prepare an itemized estimate of the cost of maintenance of public schools for the ensuing year and shall submit such estimate to the Board of Finance. The money appropriated by any municipality for the maintenance of public schools shall be expended by and in the discretion of the Board of Education. Now, the first thing I mentioned, they don't call it a budget. They call it an itemized estimate of expenditures, itemized estimate. Now, think about the way we usually refer to the word budget. And we have column A, and we have column B. Column A is what we're going to spend. Column B must be what we did spend, and they should be zeroed out at the bottom. And this is not what the legislature understood that school finance was going to look like. Because if you could spend the entire budget on July 1st, maybe you come pretty close. But you don't. You spend it for a whole year. And in some cases, it's almost 6 months before the start of that budget process. So you're trying to anticipate a year and a half into the future when a boiler could go, or another several special needs children could come in the district requiring additional services, or COVID. I mean, look at what COVID did to us in terms of anticipating spending between a mess with transportation, sanitation, just the idea of what are we going to do with our custodians. Some schools had stayed open, were open Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and spent all day Wednesday cleaning. They didn't budget for that. So again, you have to kind of have the mindset that it's an estimate. And I think it's important for you because when you're having your deliberations every February or March, and you're fighting, hopefully not too strenuously, but you're fighting over what we're going to put in the budget, understand it's an estimate. And so what we could fight tooth and nail to get could end up never ending up being purchased, either because we realized we could do it better, or the need went away, or a mandate changed. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we might not do something. And it tends to get away from fighting over minutia. Our board literally fought for a half hour whether we should buy 5 horsepower or 7 horsepower snowmobiles. What a waste of our time, what a waste of our administration's time. Everybody knows you need at least 10, but it should have been policy level. The ground should be maintained and let the buildings and grounds folks figure out the most effective way of doing it. And they would do that through presenting the budget and saying, we need these tools. We need a truck with a plow. I've been buying one of those. That's part of the purpose of we establish the expectation and then expect our administration to tell us what they need. Now, should you expect to have the case made for it? Absolutely. But go in with the understanding that our primary responsibility is to make sure kids don't slip on the ice going into the building in the morning, or that we can even open school after a storm because somebody's taking care of it. That's a reasonable expectation of the board, but how it's done gets beyond where the board is. And again, just this last part, sort of the same argument I'd make from as I did before for language in elementary school or middle school. We decided, because it was in the discretion of the Board of Education, that was important. I remember a couple towns over the years have said, we want you to use the town attorney for legal support. And I know in one district, it just happened, it was the mayor's brother-in-law. No reflection on why that was a demand. But the fact is, the board said our labor law is very intense and very well defined. We need someone who's an expert in that. Our special education law firm are experts in that. The town attorney is not. We will do what we need to do to make sure the best interest of the school district is supported. So, you are allowed, sometimes new board members, you may get requests from the superintendent probably toward the end of the school year. We have a surplus in one part of our itemized estimate, and we are short in another. And what we want to do is balance it by taking some from one item to the other. I know a lot of new board members say, well, we can't do that. It's a budget. Because in a budget, you can't. But yes, you can. You have the right to transfer funds. And I'll even go to the point of saying the document that you hand out to the community shouldn't have the word budget on it. Call it an itemized estimate of expenditures, or call it a spending plan. But get out of the use of the word budget, because we want to also get the mindset of our community members to the idea that this is our best judgment. Right now, if this document is passed, as we see it right now, this will meet the priorities of the district. But as those conditions change, so will everything else. And we'll do the best we can to steward that money properly. Yeah.
The discretionary fund was really discretionary, so only that we might go to discretionary fund, 3%. So now I want to ask.
Correct. The question was basically, you know, as you go through budgets, there are discretionary funds and non-discretionary funds. Those things that are obligated through contracts or their employees or contract, you know, would be a copier contract, but it's a contract, it exists. And so those funds can't be touched. So if you had, I forget the amount of your annual budget, but let's say it's about $20 million. Out of those $20 million, probably 18 million and a half are obligated through contracts or through required spending that you have no discretion over. And it could be 3%, as you said. So it's important to understand that when somebody says, well, $20 million, you got to be able to find 10, no problem, or 5 or 1, that you can't go through all of the 20 million. You have to go through the maybe 1 that's left to figure out where you're going to spend it, unless you lay off teachers, which means we're no longer helping the children. That's our job, is to have a quality teacher in front of the student. And if we start to cut teachers, and frankly, payroll is the biggest place in our budget. Yeah, and that's something that's newer. We didn't have to deal with that as much back when I was a board member, but thank you for mentioning that. The whole idea of pensions and stuff is significant. Partially, I'm going to say, because the state didn't accept its responsibilities for many years and adequately fund it. But when your teachers retire, there needs to be adequate funding for them. So you are, in some cases, they've changed a law to make you pay for some of that. So yeah, there's very little, you know, it ends up, do we not buy books? Do we not buy computers? Do we not rebuild a playground? Although that might be a capital expense, that's a whole other thing. There's a lot of things that we may have to give up, but it's the stuff that sometimes makes us unique. The stuff we have to cut is the stuff that would make us better, but because we don't already have it, it's easiest to take it out of the budget again. So that's a dilemma that you all have to face every year. That's a challenging. I was just getting around to that. Yes. So the question was basically, say it again. I was listening to your answer and oh yeah. So what degree do board members have to be experts in school finance? I would say that not really a lot. I would say that a couple of times, there are some people with finance experience who are assets to boards, don't get me wrong. But I have seen some people with a financial background who get involved with the budget committee and actually cause chaos, because school budgeting is very different than corporate budgeting in many ways. Well, itemized estimate versus budget, for one thing. I would say that it's appropriate to have, to share your concerns with the superintendent, who then can consult with the business manager and say, okay, let's help address your concerns, and to explain the budget or the estimate when it comes out. You know, I used to always look at increases. Why is there a 40% increase in this particular line item? Every time I've asked, I've had a very legitimate answer, but I thought it was appropriate as a board member to say, could you explain why? Maybe not even for me after a while, because I got to the point I trusted what I was hearing, but it was because I know somebody out in the community might also have that question, might be listening, and it could help put them at ease as well. So I think part of it is understanding enough of school finance so you can go out in your community and advocate for it, help to understand where the alignment is, where you're spending money, and what your goals are. I think that's a very important aspect. We have a lot of money in math instruction because we've set as a goal preparing our kids better for math or whatever. And so there's a direct connection between our finances and our goal of education, or in this case, math. But I think that's a better use of a board member's time. Now, that being said, you do want to be cognizant of are the processes and procedures in place. And I'm not saying we second guess them, but I think it's an appropriate thing for a board member to understand, at least on a basic level. How do we safeguard that what we are doing is appropriate and the money's being spent properly? But that's an easy thing, I think, to ask that question. Just help us understand how we safeguard the district's money, and not, again, looking for trouble, but to help us better understand. So when a community member asks us, we're better able to answer that. And I hope I've helped you with that. Okay, good. I think there's one more. Yep, one more. And this is the good news for everybody, because you probably hear of school boards getting sued all the time, or school districts getting sued all the time. Half of your legal budget is for special ed. The other half is all the people that are going to sue you or sue the district. And the fact is that if the issue that's causing the lawsuit is within your authority as a board, and if it's not wanton, reckless, or malicious, then you are individually held harmless. You don't have to worry about getting sued and losing your house because of the decision the board made. Typically, where there's issues are one, if the board made a decision that was way out of line, and I've seen a couple of those into six-figure settlements, in fact, or where board members individually get involved in something, and that doesn't hold harmless is protecting board members from doing things as a board. But if you start unilaterally doing things, worst case example that I can give, on one evening, the superintendent brought to the board in executive session a fact that a particular teacher, I think he probably made a mistake in identifying that teacher, but told the board, we have some complaints against this particular teacher. They're being investigated. We're prepared to go wherever it has to go. It was a high school teacher. And the reason I know that was because one of the board members went to the high school PTO meeting the next night and warned everybody about this teacher. He's being investigated for blah, blah, blah. Now, he opened up the district to potential lawsuits. He opened himself up to potential lawsuits. And it would, in any case, could cause the administration to have to settle for a settlement that was less than what they believed was appropriate in order to make it go away. Because there's nothing better than a lawyer walking up to the district and saying, is it true that you did this? Oh, well, yeah, I want this whole thing thrown out. And, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but I've worked with them for 37 years in school education law. My grasp of it is that rarely, if ever, does a judge look at a decision the board made and say, well, I look at all the data you looked at and I think you did a bad job. I'm going to overturn your decision. What happens is somebody said something, somebody didn't cross an I or cross a T or dot an I, that somehow the procedure, the process was violated, which kept them from being treated fairly. And if that happens, often the person gets away with whatever they did. So I would say as board members, the very last thing you want to do is see somebody get away with something because of something you did. So I would really be very cautious. You know, we had a grievance hearing where the teacher was grieving her evaluation. That's what filed the grievance. I got fair and I should have gotten excellent because I'm mentoring teachers who are getting excellent evaluations. Why aren't I? So she came to the board in a grievance, and we didn't even bother bringing our board attorney in for that one because it's not in the contract. You can't grieve an evaluation in our contract. So it should have been a 5-minute meeting. But what happened was kind of interesting. The attorney representing the teacher pointed to one of the board members at the table and said, Mr. So-and-so, isn't it true that you were in the supermarket on April 27th, whatever it was, talking to so-and-so, and you said, this is the worst teacher my child ever had? He goes, well, how did you hear that? He goes, it doesn't matter how I heard it. Is it true? And he goes, well, yeah, but how did you hear that? So we had to recess the meeting. It was 7 o'clock on a Tuesday night, I think. We called our attorney. She happened to be available, had to drive in from North Granby, which was probably close to an hour by the time she got there. She was on the clock, and it was a Shipman Goodwin attorney, so the clock was expensive. And we had a 5-hour hearing because we had to ensure that that teacher's rights were not infringed for that entire hearing. Now, we came to the same resolution because in the case of a contract issue, the language is what really decides what the answer is, and the language is clear. But we had to go above and beyond because this board member had opened his mouth. And that's a fairly mundane one, caused no great harm other than a lot of time and some money. But imagine if that was a termination and somebody could go back and say, you were going around town saying this, or you were going around town saying that. That could really mess things up. And I have seen school district, or the opposite can happen. Here's an example of why it's important to use the process appropriately. Years ago, this was probably 30 years ago or more, a music teacher was accused of inappropriately touching a student. The superintendent was going through an investigation. The board, as I understand it, did not wait for the end of that investigation, but fired him. And he basically had a nervous breakdown. His career was destroyed. And I happen to know someone that knew him, so I kind of followed what happened to him. And like, well, here's what happened. 20 years later, the student recanted and said it never happened. Now, a proper investigation might, maybe not, but might have found that out. And so this person's career wouldn't have been destroyed. And the school district, and by then most of those board members, all of those board members were gone, but the current board was faced with settling on a lawsuit in the 6 figures because that person was harmed by the way the board behaved. So please, whenever there's a question about legality, work with the superintendent, get the board's attorney involved. If it's at that level, definitely talk to the board attorney. Call our people. They're really good at walking you through, at least at the 50,000 or even the 10,000 foot level. You know, help us understand, do we even have to go further with this or not? And that's well worth the free phone call. And it could save you a lot of grief. But that's probably the place boards get in the biggest trouble, is being overheard saying something that isn't appropriate. So you have to kind of learn to zip it when you're a board member. And please understand, you're not just a board member. You have authority as a board only when you're in meetings, but you're always a Board of Education member. If you're here visiting your child's teacher, they still see you wearing that board hat. I don't care how friendly you are. I grew up in my hometown and was on the board there. So a lot of the teachers I was interacting with as a board member were former teachers, and I knew them. But when I was there with my kids, in fact, typically what I would do is ask my wife to do it because I didn't feel comfortable going in and putting that extra burden on the teacher, even if it's someone I knew. Did a couple times, but, and you try to look, I'm not here as a board member, please, I wouldn't, but they still see that. So it's important to remember that when in an elementary school, especially in a small community like Woodbridge, you are going to be in this building a lot if you have kids, and you just have to, or staff, if staff approach you. I mentioned before, teachers are governed by a contract. So if they have an issue with something that's going on in this building, they have due process rights to pursue it. But that is not call a school board member to make it go away. What they're doing is trying to get you to do an end run around the superintendent and make it go away, avoiding due process. And again, my experience, there could be examples where it's not true, but most of the time when a teacher's approaching a board member to make something go away, it's because they already know they're wrong and that the process would not support them. And they want you to undermine the superintendent's credibility by doing something behind the scenes to make it happen. And I see a couple of you nodding, so you may have seen something like this in the past, but it's really important. If a teacher approaches you and says, I have a problem, okay, well, you know, I'm going to direct you back to the chain of command, because if you approach let's put it in reverse. If you approach a teacher and say something that intimidates them, they can file grievance against you. There are Board of Education members that have had grievances against them. There have been some that have been sued because of their involvement in teachers beyond that employee-employer relationship. And it's really important to just understand that, you know, the last thing you want to do when you want to focus on teaching and learning, and you're embroiled in all these lawsuits, that this is not getting us where we want to go. And it may say, I mean, and again, I grew up in Bloomfield. That's where my job was as a board member. Sometimes teachers that I had known for 30 years would approach me and say, hey, you got to look at this. This is really bad. And I did get sucked in the first time because I didn't really understand it. Their case became my case. We need better furniture in the teacher's lounge. And I ended up looking kind of foolish by the time I got through, because I didn't find out what the real story was. I should have just said, probably called the board chair and said, there's been an interest in what's going on with teachers' lounge furniture. Could maybe we either get a report at the board level, or could you help me understand what's going on? And that would have been appropriate. But instead, I became an advocate for teachers when frankly, I'm the employer. I shouldn't be advocating for them. I could help guide them in the right direction. Go talk to your union rep, go talk to the principal or whatever, but it wasn't, I'll take care of your problem for you. So those are some of the hardest things as board members that you're going to have to face, is sometimes rejecting people that are coming to you for help. Now, you can say it in a nice way. Look, I really would like to help you, but I can't help you the way you need help. So I'm going to direct you back to the teacher, or back to the principal, or back to this, if need be, the superintendent. We are not part of that process as board members. If it ever comes to us, we have to be able to approach it impartially. And if I'm involved in it now, I can't do that. So it's really important to sort of learn that vernacular. You know, look, I'd love to help you, but I can't help you the way you want help. But let's try to explore, you know, well, again, expulsion doesn't work entirely here, but parent called me and said, they want to expel my student next Tuesday night. Stop before you go any further. Please don't say a word. I cannot talk to you about what your child did or didn't do. We can't talk about that. Now, let me help you understand what an expulsion is going to look like. You're going to come into a room. There's going to be administrators. There may be witnesses. You're allowed to have an attorney at your own expense. But try to put them at ease, like, here's what's going to happen, so they're not in a room with a bunch of strangers with no idea what's happening. That was an appropriate thing for me to do as a board member, not to take their case for them, but maybe advise them if you need help, you can get that. I've pretty much addressed the stuff that I felt I needed to talk to you about, but I know there were some other questions, there were some other concerns, social media. The other one I think was caucusing, was I know one that came up in our conversation the other day, but, and I'm also cognizant of the time, what are a couple of those topics we might want to explore in the next half hour, maybe 40 minutes?
Maybe. And then what happens if, let's say, you know, together there's a couple of us? Does that constitute a meeting, or does that constitute someone approaching the board? Or if we're all interacting, you know, on, you know, our town has many sounding boards, social media sounding boards, you know, neighborhood watch, etc. If someone asks a question and the information is public, and, you know, we start responding as board members, if there's so many board members responding on a thread, does that become FOIable? What are the ramifications of that?
That question, the question is, well, I guess people could hear that because it sounds like you unmuted.
Right.
Thank you.
That answer has gotten more complicated over the years, but the general premise, as sort of defined by the FOI Commission, is that you must do the business of the district in a public meeting. That the community has the right to observe you doing their business. And since you are only allowed to do business in a legally called and constituted meeting, that's where the conversations should take place. Now, there are some interesting, I don't want to say ways around that, but interesting divergences from that. Starting with, if you're at another event, so this was not called as a board meeting, but maybe it's a Board of Selectmen meeting, or maybe it's a PTO night and you're all there visiting the school with your kids. That's not a quorum of the board because you didn't call a meeting of the board and you're not there in your official capacity. Now, if you all stand in the corner talking about what you want to do Tuesday night, that would violate FOI because you don't want to talk business. But the idea, and if somebody asks a question, it's okay to kind of have a conversation with them. But, and even if it's a couple board members, as long as you're not really starting to discuss strategy and how would we approach this Tuesday night at our next meeting or Monday night, but rather to, help direct that person back to the appropriate way for them getting their question answered more effectively. On social media, email, it doesn't matter the vehicle you're using. The expectation is that a majority of you are not going to get together and talk shop outside of the board meeting. So, and even on social media, if you start it's like responding, you have to kind of modify or monitor yourselves and not allow yourselves, because especially if there's a trail, somebody could do a screenshot of all of you responding back and forth to each other. That's a meeting, that's an FOI complaint. So, and you'd lose, I'm assuming, depending on what you're talking about. So, and social media in general some people like to think that it's opened up the community to another vehicle for communication, but it's also opened up a couple of cans of worms. My favorite example is where, let's say Friday afternoon, in the old days, when I was a school board member, we barely had cell phones, let alone internet. So Friday afternoon, kindergartner falls asleep on the bus, driver parks the bus and goes home. An hour or two later, or maybe only an hour later, they realize kid's missing, find the kid's okay. Principal calls the superintendent, says, hey, we had a kid fell asleep on the bus, kid's home, everything's okay. Superintendent would probably say something like, well, okay, well, Monday morning, come on to the office or I'll come down and see you. Let's talk about it and make sure it gets resolved appropriately. But, my expectation as a board member was careful, thoughtful investigation, and then make a decision based on that investigation that makes sense for the situation. That's the old days. And by the time a reporter called on Monday afternoon, you could basically say, yeah, we had a problem, kid fell asleep, kid got home safe, driver got fired, all done. And it was over. But now what happens, if it happened at 3 o'clock, at 3:01, the entire world knows about it. But the kid didn't just fall asleep on the bus blew up going over the cliff. And it just gets exaggerated. And everybody's looking to each and every one of you to say, what are you doing about it? Now, as a board member, your expectation should still be, I want the superintendent to do a careful, thoughtful investigation and make a decision in the best interest of the child, the safety, and all the rest of the interest of the school district. And that's not going to happen by 3:05. And if the reporter calls at 3:06 and says, what's going on? The answer can't be, we're working on it, trying to make the superintendent do something. The answer should be, superintendent's aware of it. We do, and I'm sure in a situation like that, you'd probably send an email out to the board to say, there was a situation, it's been resolved, kid's safe, etc. We know the child is safe, superintendent's aware of it, is looking into it, and will render a decision shortly with a solution, and you'll hear about it. And leave it at that. Your job is not to short circuit that thoughtful, careful process, but rather to help people understand that we still expect it. The internet has taught all of us to expect instant gratification. If I order it from Amazon and it won't be here by Wednesday, I'm going to cancel the order, and I'm going to go somewhere else, and I'm going to get it tomorrow. And I've done that myself, and I hate myself for it. But that's the way people are in general now. I want immediate, because information is immediate. And I think it's important, or they will ask you questions on some very complex issues. We're seeing a few of them now, like DEI, which has some complexity to the conversations. And I, as a board member, I want to make sure I make decisions that are, again, in the best interest of the children, based on as much knowledge and information, credible knowledge and information as I can get. And so the question is, do we have to look for a venue within the board structure, maybe through subcommittee or whatever, to ensure we have those conversations, but that we're not going to, or that when someone asks us a complex question in a social media venue, that we don't just throw something out there just to satisfy the immediate answer question, but rather, you know, that's something we've been working on. We're very concerned about it. We want to do what's right. So we're continuing to have those conversations and don't feel the need to make them happy immediately, but rather what's going to help the kids, those 841 kids that we're so, you know, drastically concerned about.
So next, since you talked about social media and a little bit about board members meeting in school or whatever, could you talk a little bit about the legality of caucusing and the best practice of caucusing?
Yes. Board members from single political parties are allowed to meet together and discuss business. Caucuses are legal. However, let's say, and they did it in our town until I made a big stink about it, the board would meet with the town committee chairman. And that is an illegal meeting because it is only those members of the board from that particular caucus that are allowed to do that. You can't invite someone from the other party in and have them participate. The caucus is specifically for those members of that particular board in that particular party. So there are lots of ways you can violate that, but you know, again, there's a law that allows it. And it's hard to fight Congress where they caucus and the legislature where they caucus. But I will tell you that in a small group, that if your goal is to work together and to be more of a team, caucuses are really not the way to do it. And I can only share my own experience. I was on a board when I first got on, it was highly political. I was one of the two on a 5-2. And almost weekly, certainly every few meetings, the chair would walk in and say, we caucused last night, and this is what's going to happen tonight. And I got mad because I'm elected to this board and I don't even get a say. You don't even, you know, think, I mean, maybe you should talk, here's what we're inclined to do, let's see where it goes. But to walk in and say, your vote doesn't matter to us, your opinion doesn't matter to us, is a very demeaning feeling. And so, again, what I've heard is a lot of people talking about wanting to be an effective board, wanting to work all together. You can't do that if you're not letting everybody be part of the process. I really, truly believe that. I've seen boards recess meetings in the middle of a vote, recess the meeting, go off to two separate corners and caucus. And it's on TV. So the whole community is watching them go off and having, frankly, discussions about that motion that should be done in public. And then they come back and the other side has no clue what's going to happen because they're not privy to that. And there's a vote and half the people, or in this case, I think it was 6 or 3 people were really ticked off. And yet you don't respect us when we do this or that. Well, that's because you show me no respect either. I just think that you have to decide what kind of board you want to be. And if you want to be a collaborative board, one that whose strength is in all of your value to this board, you know, sort of a symbiotic relationship. We are stronger for the sum of our parts than we are individually. And I believe that a well-performing board is that. You are stronger together than you are individually. Throw that out the window if you're going to caucus, because there will be hard feelings. And I know I probably sound a little harsh on that. The best practices don't. Most towns, I think there's generally caucusing about officers, but not even that's universal. But outside of that, I have to say that if there's a better way, I would do it that way. And I know there probably are examples of cases where it was appropriate, but in general, it's just I think, or, you know, both caucuses go and talk to each other about the same thing and come back. We didn't have the conversation together. We didn't share our thoughts together. And I think you're short circuiting a very important part of our democratic process. It is legal. Yes. You know, if nothing else, I encourage you to be very judicious in how you use it, you know, not before every meeting or maybe even on a contentious issue, because ultimately it's the more contentious the issue that we want, the more unanimity going into this. I would hope that if we can collaborate and come up with a consensus on something, that we are stronger for it, especially if it's an unpopular decision, that we go to the community together rather than automatically assuming a third of us are going to be against it and out there undermining us in the public. Because that.
We have a great, we have 5.
Right.
4 to 1 next year. Interesting. Sort of alleviate the concern that you mentioned. So personally, at 5 to 2, I can get it. I think the 20. I already have to look for it. I think that allows a group. We don't shoot 20 different ideas out. We say, okay, let's focus on these 4 and get everybody on board. Also help get this going.
I guess I would respectfully disagree in that, well, first of all, I'm assuming we all took an oath of office when we took our seat, and the oath of office is to the community of Woodbridge and to support our responsibilities under state law, et cetera. And so we have a responsibility, because I'll tell you what, those 841 kids, none of them care whether you're a Republican or Democrat. And I have concerns that sometimes it's appropriate to have some conversations, but if you are expecting to go into a room with the 5 or the 4 others and have them fully willing to accept everything you say, I think that may fall flat because they have no, but you're making, you are often making decisions on what we're going to do when we get into that meeting. Well, you may not vote, but you may have decided. I would also say that there might be, and again, I get what you're saying, and that's why I say it's not a universal law that always works, but it might be a better use of the board's time if there's a really important issue coming up and we want to have more than just that 20-minute, 40-minute conversation in a board meeting. Let's call a special meeting, a workshop, and talk about that sort of informally, even facilitated. I mean, I do that all the time, you know, help boards through an issue by, you know, let's bring out what the issues are. Let's see if there's some consensus on this. So at least we walk away. The other night I was at a board meeting and there was one board member who had a real axe to grind on a particular issue. And he kept bringing it up and bringing it up and bringing it up. And finally, one board member said something I will never forget. In fact, it's going to show up on a lot of flip charts as we go along. He goes, when I'm challenged now, I ask myself, what do I want? He says, he said to this board member, I have heard for the last 3 meetings, because this is a recurring issue, I've heard it for 3 meetings what you don't want. But what I have never heard you say is what you want. So what do you want? And it was interesting how that paradigm shifted. And all of a sudden we were talking about, so how would someone articulate what they want? Well, in policy. So where would that appropriate policy be? But it was a conversation that only benefited from everybody at the table. And these two people that were, back and forth, apparently they are often at each other's throats at board meetings, and it's very contentious. But for that evening, it was like, okay, I'm really not trying to say this in a disparaging way, but tell me what you want rather than what you're not happy about. And it changed the dynamic. And so I think there are more opportunities to do that when you work together than in an environment where you're having those conversations. Because I'll tell you what, if you're having a meaningful conversation about DEI, for example, whatever that topic might be, your other colleagues would probably benefit from what you're saying, because they will also have a better sense of what you believe or don't believe. And ultimately, together we can make better decisions based on a collective understanding of what we believe, rather than, sort of the condensed version, which is we had our conversation, you had yours, now let's figure it out. But as I say, I don't want to come off too holier than thou in this, I really don't. Sometimes that's the way the system works. But I guess I've just been on the wrong side of too many of those conversations to feel comfortable with it. And 5-4 isn't as bad a split as it could be. If you're in a 6-3, and most towns can't be different than that, we had 5-2, you stop feeling like you're a member of the board. You stop feeling empowered. And I acted out. I mean, I can't tell you. My boss, who's an attorney, has told me I can't tell you the things I've done acting out when I was a board member, but I would hope to think I would not do that now. But I acted out, and can't take it back. The comment is that, caucusing is done in private. The public whose business you are doing is not observing that work being done. And it's different when you're just debating a vote, but you're still having conversations that will influence what's going to happen. So again, different people draw the line in different places. And again, it may be an appropriate place for some things to do that. But I think on substantive issues that this board is going to wrestle with, particularly over the next year or two, I think there's a greater strength in having those conversations together. You're welcome. So, sure.
How much should be done at the board level? What extent discussions that be replicated with the full 9?
Right.
So, that's more of a best practice question. How the boards use.
Okay, so the question in a nutshell was, how do boards use committees effectively? There's a lot of different answers to that question, because there are boards that do it very differently from each other, and some are very successful, whatever model they do. But I will say this, in 1,400 plus workshops with 160 of the 169 boards of education, almost always, if the conversation gets on committees, it's, we don't like what we do, is there a better way? If they depend strongly on committee structure, they're looking to destructure it. If they don't have committees, they're looking to start committees. So just goes to say, I think that there's no perfect way. I will say a couple of things to start, at least. If you have to replicate all the work that was done in the committee at a board meeting, don't waste everybody's time at the committee level. Understand something. When your committees meet, when your board meets, we actually, I know you use e-meeting. In fact, you're one of the first districts that took it on originally. Before we did that, I had to do some research, due diligence, to decide whether that's something we even wanted to offer boards. And the answer I got was that it takes hundreds of hours sometimes to prepare for meetings, because in its central office, and you've got a small central office. So poor Marcia's probably doing 90% of this work, putting packets together. Of course, now it's electronic, so it's a little easier. But all of the staff presentations that have to be pulled together, all of the recommendations, presentations, takes a lot of coordination, and that's time away from the other work that we need to do. So if we're doing a board meeting once a month, twice a month, once, okay, you're lucky there. But then maybe there's 4 or 5 subcommittees meeting once a month. They will demand just as much preparation as the board meeting, sometimes more, sometimes less. Do we really want our staff going through all that if it's not going to make us effective? Now, if we use our subcommittees effectively, and a lot of boards do, we have that in-depth conversation, discussion at the committee level, come to the board with the 2 or 3, 4 board members who were at that meeting to say, here's what we talked about very, very briefly. You've got a copy of the minutes, so you can read those if you want more detail. But basically, we talked about a new policy on hats in schools, going back in history, because that used to be a big deal. And so at that point, we're making a recommendation to the board. We're going to, as a committee, move the adoption of the new policy. And then board members might ask a couple questions, but in general, it's okay. We trusted the committee did all the due diligence. As long as they're happy with it, I'm going to support it. That's good use of subcommittees. But when we start to not trust our committees, or I have a lot of questions about curriculum, and the curriculum committee meets when I can't be there. How much do you take up the board meeting time asking a lot of questions when we had a chance to do it earlier? So there's no easy answer, but I guess my point is committees can help the board do more work more effectively without tying up board meeting time. But if we're doing both, then we should really think about one or the other. Do we put back on our committees and do more as a committee of the whole? Or do we do less at our board meetings in terms of those committee reports and just accept what's being recommended? Always having the right to ask a question, always having the right to vote no. You don't lose that right, but not to tie up the board. And frankly, I think when you get into a conversation where the committee's presented something and there are a lot of questions, I think any one of you, or maybe it's the chair, but certainly any one of you could say, you know what? This is taking a lot more time than I thought it was going to. I move that we refer this back to the committee for further discussion. They've heard what we have now said. They've heard our questions. They can better respond to those in a subcommittee vehicle and then come back to us and try again, rather than taking up the board business time, because you've got other things that you have to get done on your agenda. So that's a start. I think committees that exist just to be committees is a real mess as well. You know, we've got a policy committee, so we have to meet every month. We're not really talking about any policies, so we'll just talk to Jonathan and say, hey, at our next meeting, can we talk about such and such? Well, that's make work. That's not something that's designed to help us do better. So I think that's an example where committees meet when necessary, or and to make sure that you have the appropriate committees. I won't mention the district, but they had 9 subcommittees, and they met every month. And that was part of our Lighthouse training, where we talked about research-based board work that effectively improves student achievement. It's a long process. I don't want to divert to that, but that was one of our Lighthouse boards. They've been through 2 years of training. And as part of what we were doing to get them to the next level was, okay, now that you have a better understanding of the work you need to do, let's talk about more effective ways of doing it. And so they brought up committee structure. We have 9 committees. Our superintendent or an assistant superintendent is at every single one of those meetings, every single one. So why do you have 9 subcommittees? Well, because we wanted each member of the board to chair a committee. That was why they had 9 subcommittees. And basically, people got to make up what they wanted. One guy happened to like athletics and happened to be interested in what happened in the cafeteria. So they had a subcommittee called Cafeteria and Athletics. Well, what do you talk about? Well, we talk about credentials for coaches or captains. You know, how do we choose team captains? That shouldn't be a board decision. You know, but they were making business to rationalize having the committee. And so we ended up spending an evening going through, we had a big rubric, and here's all the stuff you do, and here's how you do it now. What's a usable number of committees? Well, they came up with 3: teaching and learning, finance, and policy. And so, well, we had about 100 things they were doing in those 9 subcommittees. So how do you do this? Well, that sounds to me like it's a finance issue. You should go to the finance committee. This one, maybe it has to go to curriculum, maybe it has to go to policy, but it's not policy and curriculum. You know, so again, I think it was just a matter of helping them rethink how committees were used. And I would say that if it's an issue here, we might do well to maybe spend an evening to talk about board operations versus, you know, roles and responsibilities, but how are more effective ways of using our meeting time, including subcommittees and such, because they can be extremely valuable. But I know in my district, we had a curriculum committee, and back then they were a little different. Now they're more district driven or staff driven. We had a curriculum committee that had the hour-and-a-half meeting followed by the hour-and-a-half presentation at the board meeting. And I finally just dissolved it as chair. I said, this is ridiculous. If we're going to do the same work twice, we're just going to do it at the board meeting. And with it, sort of a directive to the superintendent to limit the presentation to what was most important, keep that down to 15, 20 minutes if possible, and leave the rest of the time for the discussion at the board level, that robust conversation we were trying to generate. So, I mean, I'm distilling a whole lot of thoughts, but did I beat that one to death yet? Do you have something else?
This is a point of information, Kirsten, on your question, Maria. I'm told that the town of Woodbridge will be hosting a representative from the Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission to do some kind of all board members of the town and also the Board of Education in the next couple of months. So that person will cover that.
That's probably Tom Hennick, I'm assuming. Tom knows it better than anybody, and he's a former school board chair, so he understands your needs really, really well.
If any new board members want to hear a similar presentation before whenever that happened in September, he came in 2019 and presented to new board members, and that YouTube is on the Woodbridge, whatever the YouTube channel. So you could go back to, I think it's September 2019, and Tom Hennick is the title of the presentation. And that could be an introduction. It's an hour long, it's the whole meeting, but he had some great information.
Whenever there's a dispute, Tom is usually the one that steps in to help adjudicate it. So he's the best at knowing how to stay out of trouble to begin with. So that's always a great benefit. And it's good for all the town officials to hear it together. So there's less potential for conflict later. Grab the notes real quick, email, outside of the don't use email to communicate with each other, did I understand you've recently given everyone a district email address? Okay, it's really important that you use that for your board business. One of the things that has developed over time is federal laws on retention of records, meaning that if board business was done, if you used email to do board business, for certain things, like example, let's say a special ed parent called you with questions about their child's needs. If that ended up going through due process because they weren't happy with the IEP and it was just a mess, technically it's a legal matter and they could subpoena your computer if they can show that you used your home computer, your home email. Like if they have your Gmail address as copies of emails they have, they can require that you give them your home computer to be gone through to see if there's any other relevant material. If you use the school district's email address, again, the district archives and backs up all of this stuff. And if there was ever a request for discovery for any of this stuff, the district is able to get that much easier than you can. So just on a practical level, it is so much more important to separate the two and do your board business on the board account and the others for your personal stuff, because it could just get really complicated. I know one board chair who was a state employee and she was doing board business on her work account, and it was subpoenaed for 2 weeks, I believe it was, during a case. And at the end of those 2 weeks, well, actually what happened was her employer, which was the state, said, as long as your computer's not here, neither are you, you're suspended till we get your computer back. And that took a couple weeks of, no pay. So it's important to understand that this is provided to you for a lot of really good reasons, and it really is in your best interest to take advantage of it. I know a lot of boards still don't do it, and that's one of the first things I try to do with them is please set up an account for your board members, because it's just critical. I'm happy to stay as long as you want, but I don't know about you, but it's hot in here. I'm pretty tired.
Anything else?
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I want to thank you, Nick, for your time tonight. And I think you've given us a lot of information. I'm going to suggest to the board that you go home, think about what was said tonight. If you have any questions, I think you can reach out to Nick personally, or if you think that there's something that we need to delve into deeper, we'd be happy to invite Nick to come back.
Always.
Thanks.
Okay.
All righty.
Can I adjourn the meeting, or do you have to vote?
No, I think I have to do public comment. Is there any public comment? I'm going to check the participant list. I don't see any hands raised in the participants list. So we'll move on to adjournment. I see Dr. Ross. Would you like to make a motion to adjourn, Dr. Ross?
Yes, please.
Okay, so Dr. Ross is making a motion to adjourn at 9:25 p.m. Do I have a second to that motion? Jay? Thank you. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to call the roll. So Maria?
Yes.
Sarah Beth? Sarah Beth said yes. Maria said yes. Brooke? Brooke said yes. David? David put his thumbs up. Jay? Jay said yes. Jeff Hughes? Jeff Hughes said yes, and I say yes, it's unanimous. Thank you all for your attending this evening, for your participation. And again, thank you to Nick Caruso for his presentation and board training. Hope you all have a nice night. Talk to you all soon. Bye.